I cleaned off my palette from last week, and you can tell that the earth colors are the ones that dry quick and the ones that have white in them. So I used a scraper to scrape off the paint and put a little bit of a bristle brush with mineral spirits and clean this area off. I've poured some medium into a bottle cap here. This is what I had left from last week that's kind of dirty. The medium I'm using right now is GALKYD, which is a resin medium made by Gamblin that helps the paint to dry, and if you put more GALKYD in it, it'll dry faster. But it's a third mixture of GALKYD, GAMSOL, which is just a good grade of mineral spirits, and walnut oil. And I like this medium. It's pretty clear and clean. It doesn't tack up. I don't have a lot of GALKYD in it, so it keeps my paint wet for a little bit longer. I'm going to be using that to just wet the surface of the painting, oil it in, so to speak, so that when I work, it feels a little bit more like a wet surface. And then I've replenished my colors, English red or terra rosa, a little bit more Prussian blue. I added some fresh white, and my other colors were still good and wet. I also added more clove oil as I keep my oil colors in this shadow box, and my little cups or bottle caps were getting low. And the clove oil really helps keep your paint wet for a longer period of time. I don't mix any paint with the clove oil, but I use it to keep the painting, if I place a painting in a shadow box, or the oil's wet for a longer period of time. Now I'm going to remix the same color palette that I had from last week. So I've mixed up about the same palette that I had last time. This is the Indian red. This is a little Prussian blue mixed in, and then I've pulled those both down with white. This is just yellow ochre and white, raw sienna and white. This is vermilion and a little Prussian blue on this side, and vermilion with a lot of Prussian blue on this side, and I've pulled each of those down with white. This is vermilion and white, and this is yellow ochre and vermilion and white. So I'm still only using these two reds, Prussian blue, and these two yellows, raw sienna and yellow ochre. Mostly yellow ochre because it's a little brighter. So you'll want to keep, pull all your colors down with white so that you can have at least 3 values of those colors. And we'll also mix in with these as we go. Okay, I'm using the GALKYD mixture with walnut oil, and I'm just gonna, and I using a soft sable, synthetic sable type brush. And I'm just going to paint a thin, I want to make sure the paint's dry, and it is, a very thin coat over the whole thing, just to oil it in. I've only dipped one time, and this is a pretty absorbent brush, so it grabbed a lot of medium on it. And you'll see that this just kind of re-wets it. I'm only dipping the corner in the medium. It really didn't take much at all. My paint has filled in the tooth of this paper now, so this next layer will be a lot more satisfying to paint into because it's not going to be so absorbent, and I hope that the paint will move around a little better. It's a damp day, it's raining, so that will also affect how fast the painting dries. And I've just gone both ways with it. If I feel like it's drippy at all or thick, I would get a little bit of a rag and wipe it off. Let me turn it sideways so that you can kind of see. It is wet, but it's not soaking wet. My lighting today, as I work back into this, like I said, it's a rainy day, so I'm in here in the studio. It is about, it's morning, so it's the light is pretty even right now, and I'd rather use natural light than the fluorescents, although they are color balanced. I have closed the shades behind the computer monitor and the easel so that I don't have any backlight, and my light is coming from behind me onto the canvas. I have looked over all the brushes that I had out and made a few changes. Since I'm going to be working in a little bit lighter, less aggressive method, I'm going to use some longer brushes. This is an Egbert, and this is a long Filbert, and these are synthetic Filberts. Thank you, Harriet. I'm going to try these out because they're softer. And I also have my Rosemary Mongoose and this goat hair mop to keep myself from getting the edges too hard. So we'll see, and we may add a few more brushes as well. The first layer, you're pretty aggressive, so you use more of a hog hair type bristle or the ivory hog hair like synthetic bristles to really be able to get in there and get the paint on. I repositioned my easel a little as I had some glare. With a dark background like this, you're going to have a lot of glare, and I did neglect to mention that before your dark color dries, it's a good idea to go from left to right over it with a mop brush or a very soft brush to knock any ridges off. A horizontal ridge will hold light, and once the reflections dry in a dark painting, it's very difficult to get rid of them. Daniel Green always said to go left to right and knock those ridges off. Since I used a mop on the whole thing, it really helped to minimize those reflections, but it still will be strong glare on a dark painting. It's just hard to get away from that. I'm going to start out just redrawing a little bit, kind of working from the top down. My drawing is pretty good. The hair needs to be warmer. So I've picked up the English red and the Prussian blue for this dark area at the top. And I'm just going to start correcting my colors now. And most likely we'll get most of this all wet again today so that I can redraw and blend these colors together where they need to be blended. While I have that color on my brush, I try to work this way. I just go around and put it anywhere I even think I see it. I have the image that I'm looking at on the monitor, and I have it enlarged and full length. I've zoomed in a little bit so I can see detail a little better. Today, I'm not looking through the blur as much. I'm still moving carefully and drawing because it's real easy to start losing the drawing at this point. There's a little piece over here that is warmer than I had it. So now we can start comparing. So I had areas that were bluish that needed to be a little redder and warmer. So you're asking yourself, is the value of it, the lightness or darkness of it right? And is the temperature right? Is it warm or is it cooler than what I have on the canvas? And really, you can't make these decisions as well until you have something on here to compare it with. So this is a much more interesting, again, and satisfying stage. I started out with this being very warm yesterday, and when I went back in and redrew, I put that cold blue back in it again. So I need to warm it back up and make it look more hair-like. I'm moving now to just the raw sienna, and I'm going to put some notes of the lighter color of raw sienna. Maybe a little darker version of it with some Prussian blue in it, just to shadow that down. Especially out here close to the background where, and I may need to measure again to see how wide from the eyebrow to the edge of the hair is the same as from the eyebrow to the corner of the mouth on my reference picture. So that's about right. I don't need to get any bigger with that hair. There's a tendency to make hair too big. or not large enough, and the head will look awkward. The face will be too big and your proportions will be off if you don't get the head large enough. There's a lot of bold strokes in this hair. There's not a lot of blending. Sargent left his strokes pretty unblended. You can see an individual stroke right there. See a bit of a stroke there. Across here is just the raw sienna or yellow ochre. It's a little bit brighter. If it feels brighter to me, I'm going to move to the yellow ochre. Some brighter tones right here. There's definitely brighter tones up here on this little curl. And here. And I'll prepare this area here. It's probably going to have some Naples yellow on top of it. This area of the bangs was worked most likely wet into wet with the skin tones. So it will only work good when I get that forehead wet again with some skin tones. But I am going to go ahead and I'm using a little bit of the raw sienna with the English red mixture mixed into it because it's not real yellow, but it's not terribly orange either. Kind of in between the two. Goes all the way down here. Starting to get too red with it. So you see the first stab at it is just to get your values and some placement in there. And then the more you work, the more you correct these values. Asking yourself all along, is it warmer? Is it cooler? Is it lighter? Is it darker than what I have on the canvas? And looking at the shape, so this medium shape or medium dark shape here is angled this way. And you see this long filbert is got a nice feel. And it glides over this medium really in a nice way. So we've done some videos, or we watched a video with Helen Van Wyck where she will put the highlight of the hair in this way like a halo around the head. And then she'll come back in and affect it this way. But you can definitely see how the light is wrapping around the head in sort of a halo fashion here. So I think I'll move on down. There's a little bit more while I've got this color on the brush. And it's helpful if you will use, to keep from muddying your colors a lot, if you'll go ahead and just lay this brush down. That's what I plan to do. And get another color for the flesh tones when I start moving into flesh. I'm going to put a little bit of a feeling of the hair down here. There's a warm yellow-orange tone right here. I'd rather err on the side of oversimplifying this hair. He has a lot of strokes, and when you're copying someone who's very impressionistic, it's hard to keep a genuine, authentic flow if you're trying to copy every single stroke. Now, there is added value to trying to, I've seen people measure and count strokes and try to paint a painting with as few strokes as possible. So there's value to that. I just think this is just our impression of this painting. And so if you try to copy every single stroke, you're going to lose some of the spontaneity of just interpreting this head in your own light. So I'm putting my brush up and I'm going to use another similar size brush, another filbert. I need a little bit larger, so I'm going to use this number 2. It's about the same as that one, maybe a little bit bigger, to start working on some of the skin tones. So my version of her face is a lot more yellow than what I have, and that's too yellow. So you'll have to see as you make these judgments where the value really needs to be. So because this is the lit side, but not the lightest. The lightest is right here and right here. I'm going to go ahead and this is my mixture of vermilion and yellow ochre. And I think this is a pretty clean color. It's getting lighter as it's moving toward the center of her cheek. It's very light right here. Right here, I should say. Sometimes it's easiest, Shirley used to say, my teacher, that we're like bugs, we're attracted to the light. So sometimes it's easiest to see the lightest lights and go ahead and record those. And then come back and adjust them if needed. Many painters will save the lightest light till the end. Sometimes I think that is for dramatic effect when they're doing a demo, but it also makes sense to work in the middle range as long as possible, because that's where most of the activity is, and then come back in later and pop your lights. But it really helps me to go ahead and record some of the lightest lights. There's some reflected light on her chin right here, but it's not as light as up here. As you move down the face, the light is less intense. It's lightest right in this area. It's light up here on the bow, but as you move down, it's pretty light on the neck here, but as you move down in here, it's not quite as light. So again, I'm thinking about where else can I put this value while it's on my brush. It's quite warm up here. It's not as light here, so I could probably go ahead and place a little bit more here. There's a warm rim right on the edge of the shadow here. So you have light, and then usually have a pretty glowy warm color right along the edge of the shadow as you move down the chest a little bit. There's a really beautiful warm tone. I'm going over here for just the vermilion. I can see it in my close-up shot over here, right here on the edge of her nose. That's probably too warm, but I can adjust that while I got it on my brush. I'm going to go ahead and place it there and here. The vermilion by itself is a little too red, so I'm going to put a little yellow ochre with it. I haven't done anything with her lips yet. And there's also a really pretty warm tone up here under her bangs. I think that's too light. Go a little bit darker with it. Whoops, too dark. So whatever you do today, here's the beauty in oil paint. Whatever you do today, if you don't like it, you can wipe it down and you will have the painting underneath that you started with. So that's the beauty of working in oils, is you have lots of forgiveness. So I'm just kind of enamored with the red right now. That's too light. This is all shadow side, so everything needs to be in a darker range on this side of the face. So I'm going to use my vermilion with a little blue in it just to darken it for this section right here by her cheek. Some warm color over here by this ear that I don't have in. And sometimes it's okay to go ahead and overshoot that, because you can definitely work it in a little bit later. But listen, we have all this beautiful color. Why would we not use it? There's some warm tones right here in the on the nostril, right here by her tear duct a little bit. And you notice I'm still working in a mosaical fashion. I'm really not blending much. I am trying to think about value, how light or dark it is. Still not really thinking about detail yet. I'm just trying to mass in these areas and get the feeling of this head. There's a little warm note on her chin. I need to move my image up a little. Yep, right along here next to the shadow. A little bit of warmth. And I can correct and warm up this shadow under her chin. It's way too cold. And as I'm looking at the image, it's quite a bit warmer than that. So I'm going to try, first off, just scumbling a little warm color over the top. Not really changing it much, not really adding a lot of thick paint, but just warming that up a little. That looks more like the right color and value. I have a kind of an orange tone from the Indian red that I put under there. So I'll look and see where else I see that. When I blended with the mop brush last week, I got a lot of this lavender. I spread that lavender around on the face, and that's a really cold color. You have to remember this is still flesh. So as I'm correcting myself, I'm just barely putting a little paint over that gray to warm it up. It's warmer over here. We want it to read like skin tone. We don't want it to read like dead. And there's some reflected light on this side of her face. Now, the tendency is going to be to make this too light over here. Remember, you're in shadow. So nothing on this area is going to be as light as this side because this is the shadowed side. But it is important to get that reflected light in there. So I'm just using some raw sienna. Just a little bit of red that I have on it is enough. Then it gets a little less light as it goes down. The chin is very yellow. That little mark, little shadow mark under her lip is pretty cool. So it's about the right value. It's dry though, so it's standing there like a sore thumb. And I'm in the raw sienna mix right now, which is warming. It's going to warm this up. Just put a little bit of yellow on there and roll it into that shadow color, not too much. I still don't have the chin light enough. It's pretty light. Oops, too light. Not that light. But since I have some wet paint there, I can work it in. And I can go even lighter on this area here. I want to be careful not get too light with that on the neck. It's very yellow. She has a real light plane under this eye as well. So I'll get to that. Interesting modeling. I don't have my glasses on, which is probably good. So I don't have readers or my contacts in. So I'm just about the right distance from the canvas. I'm about 3 feet, 2.5 feet from the easel, which is pretty good for me. I'm making myself stay back. I'm holding the brush back on the back side of it. I'm not choking way up on it. You're going to be really tempted to jump in here and start doing some detail, but try to stay in this mosaical fashion, correcting your values and your temperatures. This value is about right. It's a cool blue value. Get a clean brush. Have yourself a little arsenal of clean brushes. I don't know why I'm using that word so much, but you want to be able to clean up any areas like that. Her earlobe on the right side is not right. It's in the lit side. It's getting some really dark. Oops, too light. About the same value as the skin right here, and there's no separation much there. This may be a tad bit lighter. And again, this is the vermilion and yellow ochre mixture that I'm using mostly. That's the mother color for this skin tone. So I've taken a picture of this stage in my painting, and I have grayscaled it. This enables me to look at my values and the shapes of my darks and midtones. So I can see a few areas that I need to refine. And a lot of times I'll work for a few minutes with this grayscale version up. I've deposited approximate color in the spots. So now I'm going to go back in and redraw and adjust my values a little bit. I usually look for the biggest problems when I've stepped away, and I can tell the shape of her face is a little off over here. I may be getting it too wide, but I can come back in there. The face turns right here at even with the lips, so the angle changes right there. The chin disappears into this shadow, value-wise. So my value's a little too light. I can just blur that a little. This side looks pretty good to me. I can bring the dark up just a tad. It's too dark. Just a tad right there. I think I have her face a bit wide right here. That looks a little better. I have this too light, and this is a bit too light. But it's hard to judge because there's a lot of color in this. But when I look at them on the screen, I can see that this dark area here and this color, which I know is a little fleshy and a little yellow. I can remember that from just my memory. Is a little warmer and darker. See if that helps. I'm not going to work too long this way because I don't have the advantage of color, but I do want to correct some of my shapes right now and values. There's no transition here, so this needs a little bit of a softening. And this shape, I'm pretty much using the same color that's already on there. There's an angle here that I don't have. This is darker over here. Bit of a curl here. My angle for the hair is a bit off, and it drops down like this. Actually this way, and then it rolls that way. And this area here is dark. And that's a curl, so we know that we have to put it in this way and then we have to affect it this way to get it to look like a tubular form. And my values are fine here, so I'm going to wait till I have color to decide the temperature for this area. The ear is jumping out. It's way too red, way too light. So the value looked right to me, but it was not. It was just high intensity color. It made me misjudge it a bit there. That is also too light. All right, so that feels better. I have some areas around here where the brows need to go back in. I've lost those. It's probably going to be too dark, but I'm going to put those in anyway, just to remind myself that that's where those go. Huh, that looks funny. And I toned this light area down already. This area of the glabella. The value is dark enough. It is not dark enough on the eye area yet. So I'm going to put a note to remind me to get darker there and darker there. All right, it's bugging me. So I want to go ahead and work on the eyes a little bit. And I've kept the grayscale image up. I'm looking at it, the full view, also a zoomed in view. And for the eyes, I may zoom in even a bit more just to see these shadow shapes because her eyes are pretty distinctive. It's a warm tone, but I don't want it too red because it tends to look like a little bit of pink eye if they get too red. Too red. So I got to find just the right value here. And get the angles in here right. Watch out for any thought of almond shapes here. They are almond, but there's a lot of variety with angles around these eyes. Usually I like to put a cool tone in, and it's hard to tell. That's too light. Put that in first, just to kind of get an idea of the eye whites. Sargent talked about preparing the eye socket and then dropping the eye in, sort of like a poached egg. So I'm gonna have to back up and think that way because I'm already wanting to do the irises before the socket and the eyeball. So it makes sense to me to think about what came first. And the socket is there with the ridges, the brow bone, the ridge under here. These are all important things to think about. And when I first started doing portraits, I didn't know whether to work on the lids first. Nobody really gave me a suggestion as to what should come first. I just watched people do it different ways. Got that color too. That's too brown. That's really a warm red tone up there by her brow. So she's starting to look a little scary here, but again, I'm trying to think about the socket right now. And then I want to move and around the socket, and there's a light tone, usually almost always a light tone by the tear duct. And under the under eye ridge. That maybe should go on last. She appears to have blue eyes. They're dark. And I usually ask myself, does the eye white feel cool or warm, like skin tone? And I see both. I see more warm tones in this eye because it is in shadow. And I believe I've misjudged my value over here on this eye. And this eye is in light. And I do see some cool lavender-ish tones, but also I see fleshy tones in there. So I'll have to go back and check my values again. Go ahead and put a little bit lighter on that since it's wet. Prepare this socket a little bit more. This side is quite dark. I don't think I have it dark enough. Her lids are very dark. And this shadow on the left eye is very dark. I have to keep going back in and restating that as I do this shadow under the nose and the nostril. It's a very warm tone under the nostril. It's probably too dark, but I can always soften that back up, and it's warm right there. Warm. And there's a really nice warm tone on this side of the lip as I move down that side of the face. Now I've prepared the lids, and there's a really dark lash line right under the lid. I'm using a big brush, making myself continue to use the big brush. So I'm trying to put these dark notes in anywhere I see them. There's a little dark note there. And this dark piece wraps around the eye a bit. Now I'm going to mix up a little bit of a dark blue, and I'm going to mix some of that English red in with it too to make it not so cold, but just a dark tone. And since I've already got the light on there, it's not going to register very dark. It's not the usual way that I do eyes. I usually am much more detailed with the eye, but I'm trying to just do really nice bold strokes that I've seen Shane and Kinsler demonstrate. One brush stroke for the iris. I've got some things going on here that need to be corrected. Red and blue, or red and green, but this orange and blue, Indian red and Prussian blue makes a nice dark brown. So that's going to work for around these lids. And just getting the shape right is going to be key. This eye that's in shadow is pretty mushy. So resist the temptation to over define it. Just leave it kind of blurred out and soft. I'm going to go ahead and put the light area. Remember that an eye is a lot like a marble. So the light passes through, and you have a little area of refracted light opposite of the light source. So the lighter spot will be on the left side of the iris on both eyes. And here again, I'll have a tendency to make it too light, and I did. Go back in there and correct it. The eye that's in shadow will have less of a refracted area in it. And the Prussian blue by itself is way too bright, so you're going to have to tone it down with some Indian red. All right, I'm getting close to overworking it. It's okay if you make the eyes too big at this point, because you can come back in with the skin tone and carve them back down. So I've changed brushes again. I'm going back to the flesh tone, and I'm going to come back in here with some lights. Remember, this light on the shadow side is never as light as this left side. So don't overshoot that. She looks a little scared. I'm switching to a smaller brush to correct my drawing a little bit on these eyes. But I'm going to have to be really careful because I'll get in here and do too much if I'm not careful. When you work on eyes, it's good to work on them at the same time. There's a rhythm. If you work on one eye at a time and then move to the other eye, sometimes they don't even look like they go together. So what you do to one eye, jump over and do to the other eye. This is a grayed down blue, so be careful and don't mix up, even though I know you want to, mix up a really bright blue. I'm going to go back in there and put the moon in there. I call it probably too light. Put a little bit more blue with it. See, I did it. Made them a little too bright. Can't help myself. So I'm dipping into the ivory black now for the pupils. You can mix your own black, but I like to use ivory black. And I'm going to come in here. The pupils are always round, unless it's a Siamese cat. And they are right in the center. There's always a ridge. The eyelid creates an awning over the top of the eye to protect it. And so there's always a shadow right under that top eyelid. So I'm darkening that. I had dark brown in there, and I'm putting just a little bit of black in with my brown to darken that awning. There's a bold stroke, light stroke under this eye that goes up into her eye white, and it's flesh colored. And that is part of what's going to make it look like her. So I would focus. This is quite a bit darker. The eye white right here. And I made that ridge a little too wide. Got to be careful with this little brush. You'll get in here and start piddling, and you'll lose the loose technique. I drop down a little bit lower right there. And then I can come back in with the flesh. If I made that strip under the eye, which is about the thickness of a piece of bacon, if you make that too wide, it'll look droopy and funny. So I can come back in underneath and carve off the bottom of it. I need to fix my transitions, and I'm just barely dragging a filbert over the edge of these transitions to knock them down. There's a real pretty transition right here on her cheekbone. And there's several ways you can blend. You don't have to use a soft brush. You can put a medium tone on there and change the plane of the face with the tone. This is a real colorful, most colorful spot on her cheek is right here, and I don't have it quite bright enough. Right here. And right here, straight over. So when you're painting wet and wet, you may want to turn your brush around and hold it like so that you can see your rings. You have less pressure when you do that. It's pretty red. I'm going to use a little, it's the first time I've used Naples yellow. I'm going to use a little Naples yellow with this vermilion to make a pretty peach color. Let's see what happens. For right here. Yeah, that's nice. And that goes all the way to the edge of her nose. We'll look around and see where else I see it. Peachy color right here under her eye socket. Right here on the front plane of her cheekbone. Right here on the ridge of her nose. I made that a little too red. And I've got too strong of a line on the bridge of her nose. A tiny bit of that peachy color right as her nose turns and that plane turns down. It's a really sharp line right there that I don't have, that I need to go back in and get. That peachy tone is also on her ear. Right here. And then the dark red tone is on the bottom of the earlobe, and that helps roll the earlobe under so it's not a hard edge. Almost a triangular shape on this ear that I don't have in. Try to make yourself constantly look for shapes and don't think about whether it's a nostril or an ear, but just think about the shape. Don't forget this wide angle on her face. It's easy to lose that. Try to remember to change brushes so you're not using one brush for the whole painting. You'll end up with a lot of muddy color if you do that. So I'm switching between some of these hair color brushes and flesh tone and at least background brushes. Some warmth there. I haven't done much work on this nose, so I probably need to get back in there and work on the shape of that nose a little more. So again, there's a strong angle right here, and that angle comes straight down. So I'm going too far with it. I'll come back in with the shadow color. Carve it back down. If you get her nose too wide, it will automatically look like it's too short. So you have to come back in and check the width all the time. This nostril and this angle is much higher for the tip of the nose. It's up here. There we go. Then there's a lost edge right here in the middle of the bridge of her nose, where it just melts and rolls. Don't forget the other side of her nose. It's easy to work on that shadow side and just leave all this the same value, but remember that the nose sticks out more than any other feature on the face. And we have a tendency to neglect it. So you have to think about all the plane changes that go across the nose. This is dark. And this light plane comes up almost even with her eyelid right here. It's all shapes. That's too light, but I'm putting it in while I'm thinking about it. There's a lighter plane right here. If you're working in wet and wet, you can use a little bit lighter color than you normally would if the paint was dry, because you're mixing on the canvas. Stepped away from it again, and I took another picture, and this is my second grayscale comparison. So I want to double check my values and the shapes, especially of my darks and my edges. So one of the first things that jumps out is that this area is not quite light enough, but if I darken the cheek a bit right here, it's going to make this read a little differently. So it's probably about right if I darken this area. The eyes need adjusting here. This is too dark. The nostril is a little wide. I just need a stroke here. I need to finesse in here a little bit, get some soft transitions with these lips, which is just a mongoose brush to soften those areas. So a lot of softening needs to happen right now, and a little bit of value adjustment. I can sharpen this edge here, and probably the first thing I'll do is darken this shadow. I'm going to move to a small mongoose brush, because I want to have a light touch. I don't want to mush into the paint too much right now. I want to kind of lay it on the top. Shadow, I'm going to go ahead and pull up color version of this as well, because I want to make sure I get that temperature right with that shadow when I darken it. And it's quite red because it's cheek color. It's a really dark red. So it's just right along here. And I've got, it's Indian red, a little vermilion, and a little Prussian. But I don't want it to be too bluish. So I put a little bit more red in it. Get too much red and it's not dark enough. So it's particularly dark right across from her upper lip. That's where the darkest place is. And you notice that it won't register because the paint is so wet unless I kind of lay it right on the top. It's dark enough under her lip. It's dark enough beside her nose. It needs to be dark all the way up this ridge to her eye. That is not dark enough. So I'm just kind of dabbing it on. maybe right in here a little. Tiny bit here. And all that is pretty sharp, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time softening all these areas around the eyes. Everything is too harsh. Let's see, the inside of her mouth is pretty dark, but I could define it a little bit more. And I'm going to use a small brush for that. This is one of those synthetic filberts. A little bit too blue, so I'm going to warm it up with some more red. The darkest part of that mouth is right here. And this part on the side is not quite as dark. It does have a bit of an angle here. Remember those circles on the bottom lip, and remember there's typically 2 on the upper lip. I'm going to go ahead and draw those shapes in right now a little bit. The mouth usually turns up a little. And it's a real pretty warm lip color right here. This little synthetic brush is just the right size for that lip. So if you can use the right brush size, that's half the battle. That would have been better if I'd have had a little bit more of the rosy color on there first before I laid that lighter plane in. So I'm going to go back and redo that. Reminder of this pretty peachy color I mixed up with the Naples yellow a minute ago is right here on the edge of the nose. There's some there. Here. And maybe, might be room for a little permanent rose in there to brighten that red up. Yeah, that's pretty. Oops, I've got some dark in there somehow. Didn't mean to do that. That is the lit side, so that will not be dark. So again, I'm making her lips too big. That means I'll have to come back in and carve them back down with the flesh color and the shadow color. I like this little synthetic filbert, so I'm going to go back in there with a little flesh. And now when you're working back in, you got to make sure, this is where your gray palette comes in handy, because you want to make sure your value is right when you come back in. This is a little too light. Nostril turns that way. There's a little bit of that greenish color, again, which was raw sienna and Prussian blue. Remember, yellow and blue makes a greenish color, but the raw sienna is a duller blue. So I'm going to put a little of that right here for the fulcrum, because I didn't have that in. And a little bit of that down here on the shadow side for the lip. Tiny bit here. Tiny bit of that up here as well. It's not brown here, it's got a little greenish cast to it. So wherever I'm finding that raw sienna, this is a soft brush, so it's working really well to just barely, softly skim over the surface. I'm going to grab a little bit more of this dark for right under the lip, and I'm going to push that lip up with it. That's warmer. Right here is warmer than this greener color there. So I'll come back in a few minutes and soften those together. Reminder that this is a little bit darker. Her lips are too harsh now, so I'm going to have to go back in and clean those up a little bit. Another reminder is that you get a chance with this. We could totally wipe off everything I've done today. So it's really working without fear. I'm going to go ahead and see if I can lay that little bit of light on there. I'm kind of combing it like combing hair a little bit, just barely rubbing over the top surface. This under eye socket is a little bit darker and warmer than I had it. I'm adding a little bit more of a brighter red. I just don't feel like this cheek area right here is red enough before I start blending it down. You want to kind of overshoot things so that when you do start blending, you have things big enough to withstand your blending so that they don't just totally disappear when you start the blending. I love that color, so it's a really good chance to use it. And I think I got that too light. So what I did was I mixed some Naples yellow and vermilion together. And I got some dirty color on that upper lip. So I wanted to clean that up a little. This is a really bright red. I'm going to come back in here and fix this mouth that I goofed up. So you see it's a painting back and forth, back and forth. You make things too big, then too small, then too big. So now I want to use a rosemary, or if you don't have a rosemary, you can use a small blending brush. I have my students pick up these little cheap watercolor brushes. They come in a set of 25 at Big Lots, or Hobby Lobby has them, and they look pointed when they have the sizing in them, but then they're very soft. And they allow you to come in here and just barely soften small areas without moving the paint around very much. I really like the rosemary for this. I want it to be totally dry. A mop brush is too big because it would just blur all this, and I don't want to blur it now. I want to keep some of this detail. So I'm going to go in here and continually wipe my brush off so that I'm not dragging color around. And even depositing a tiny bit of color with this brush if need be, because that got a little too dirty looking. That shadow color, I want to keep that bright and pretty. So I just want to soften now. And I'm using I've kept the image of the grayscale up because I can really see how these eyes are angled down. I can do that as I'm softening. I can really emphasize this downward plane of her socket. And I can soften these hard edges out with the small blending brush. So I'm going to leave that up. I also am missing a little ridge of light under that left eye. So I'm going to try to come in. I got it too light before, and then I didn't get it light enough. So I'm going to try a middle tone and see if I can get it to register. Yep, that's a little better. I could go a tiny bit lighter. making myself use this big filbert. I actually would probably be better off using the small detail brush to try to get it. We'll see what happens. Steady hand helps for that. I could still go lighter. Maybe not. I lost a little of my lightness over here. Okay, let me get back to my blending with the mongoose or your little tiny watercolor brush. I call those maybe pony brushes. I'm not real familiar. There's a nice transition right there. Soften that out. These edges are nice and soft. There's no edge here, so we need to lose those. The size of that light plane between her eyes, the glabella up here, is a bit wider right here. Too light. If you'll make a tiny note before you commit to jumping into an area, you can see quickly if the value is too light. It's not as light as this. It's not as dark as that. There's a little plane change there. So I can soften that. And soften this, the downward sweep. And pull some of this color over where I have it a little too wide there. The shape of that ear. This is such a big dark spot here. I don't want to drag that dark anywhere, so I'm going to barely just stipple some of it off. Try to soften this area. It's a really harsh shadow in there. See how easy it is to drag that color. I'll have to come back in and restate that pretty pink color again. I'm going back to my skin tone brush, and I'm going to use some of this pretty peachy color to widen this plane again. There. Same over here. And you can really just use the filbert instead of the mongoose and just barely drag over the top of it with a little bit of that middle tone color on it. This plane here is very yellow. Oops, too light. Remember, this is the shadow side. There we go, that's better. And it's almost raw sienna right here. There's a little light plane around the end of her mouth. It's brighter right here. Yellowish and brighter. And then there's another little transition right here. This is bothering me. It's still really harsh. So let me see if I can drag down through here again. With that yellowish tone, reflected light. Bump it over a little. And then it turns right here at the bottom lip. Remember, if I get it too wide, I go over here with my background brush, put just a little bit on it, not much, because I don't want to re-wet everything, and come back in here and carve it back. Whoops, too blue. Whoops, too red. Now, when I start blending this again, I can pull it back over into that reflected light. So it's not such a hard line. There's no hard line there. There we go. Right here across from her eye, it starts to melt. And there's a nice peachy tone with the Naples yellow and vermilion right here. There. This still may be a little bit dark. It doesn't look so in my value drawing, so I'm going to be careful with it. I think it's just a little peachier right there. So I'm dragging a little bit of that peachy color in a couple places here. Reminder that this is all flesh, so you want it to read like flesh. You don't, anywhere that's too bluish or too purplish will look a little bit bruised or won't have a quality of flesh. The hardest line on the lip is right here, and all these other areas melt. This is real yellowish here, so I want to use the mongoose, or maybe this little tiny brush here, to maybe soften that so that it melts into the shadow color. This light plane comes over just a bit more. And there is a greenish tone, that raw sienna with Prussian blue, greenish tone right here on the edge of her lip. Mongoose. Try to soften again some of these transitions here. This is almost a blur. There's an angle right there. The trick here is don't overblend, because you'll lose all your nice definition. So I'm telling myself that as I do it, because there's a tendency to just go on and on and on here and lose all this pretty nose goes up that way. I don't like the lips. I've got to fix those. This upper lip looks a little bit like an Elvis snarl. It curls up into the shadow. You don't really see any edge for it. It just disappears. This is a redder, prettier redder color right there on the lip. I'm having to go back to the vermilion a lot with these lips because there's some really pretty reflected light on that upper lip, and I just don't have it. And I'm losing my space here, so I'm going to have to come down and press the lips down a little. They're getting too wide. And that's the thing. Shapes will grow as we go, and they'll get too big. Things will get too big, and we'll lose our drawing. So the tone under her nose on that upper lip is is really yellowish. Carve it down a little bit. And then there's greenish cast shadow right across here. The underplane of the nose will cast a shadow. And I'm always thinking about the ball on the tip of the nose, and then how each of these nostril, we don't see this one at all, it's lost in shadow. There's a real warm color note in that shadow right here. I'm gonna restate, borrowing Kinsler's term, that light plane there and the light plane here, because we lose those. You have to go back and get those often. All the way down. Tiny bit here. It's hitting all these planes in a real similar way. Tiny bit there. And then there's also a ridge of light on the nose here. A little shiny spot. Oops, too light. Too light. Well, I went from blending to painting with this mongoose brush, so I'm going to have to get back to my original plan. And I'm still continually softening edges. I don't want any hard edges, especially around these shadow shapes. So now I'm going to put a couple of highlights, a few highlights in the hair. And I'm using just pure Naples yellow. Whenever I lay anything in the hair, I try to go both ways. Wrap it around the head this way and then this way, as if you were combing it. It's real easy to just want to go around the head like this, but the head also is, to get the dimension, you need to wrap it this way. So there's a really, I've kind of gobbed it up. Naples yellow is really thick, so I've kind of gobbed it up. Whoops. Little piece of highlight there. A little piece here. And you notice if I don't redip, I'm just picking up that paint underneath. These are the lightest pieces. This is a bit lighter. And there's some light up here, but I'm going to mix a little yellow ochre with it because it's not as light. Yellow ochre down here. And maybe pure raw sienna down here. Just think about how the light is more diffused as you move down the body. The light source is up here. So as you move down, it's going to get the light areas are going to get less intense and darker. And there's a rhythm, you know, if you can think about it, kind of in an asymmetrical way. There's a rhythm to hair, to painting hair, as there is a lot of things, flowers. Just kind of think about it. Helen Van Wyck would say it's like putting the hair up in curlers. You think about the dimension and the way that it's moving. There's a little bit of English red color right here. It's actually raw sienna and English red. I can't get exactly the right value or color right here. That's not right. Some right there. So the way this hair is painted is sort of like little color notes and fireflies that dance around. So you have to think in a rhythmic way as you're painting it. Wrap it. This is a bit lighter on her bangs here. So it could wrap that way and then this way. I'm going to go ahead and pop a little bit of a highlight on her right eye. And I'm going to use pure white and make sure I have a nice clean pile of white with no skin on it. And a small Kolinsky sable. Load the brush up and spin it a little bit to where you have a nice point. These brushes have a belly in them. They're like sign painters use. So they'll hold a flow or they'll hold more paint. There's a little bit of a highlight on this one, but I'm going to mix some blue in it because it's in shadow. You don't want it to stick out. It's hard to find a stopping point. I would make sure some of these skin tone areas aren't too muddy. This is still jumping out a little much, and this is too. Temptation would be to use pure white on this bow, and I already have a value of gray on it. It's not the same as what Sargent has here, but it's easier for me if you sneak up on it and you start with a darker version underneath it than where you intend to go. Use a big brush for this so you're not piddling too much, breaking the form. The lightest part, just note the lightest part, and once you've got wet paint on there, you can come back in here and use a lighter touch to just lay that pure white on top of it. And then on the collar, I'm just going to come down here and use the same bit of paint. It's lightest right here in the front. And right here on the top. I'm not reloading the brush, I'm just using what I've got. This is that long Egbert or filbert, extra long filbert. It's 3 stripes, 4 stripes. There's a lot of yellow in this, but I think it may be varnish. It's hard to tell. When you're looking at these old paintings, the varnish always yellows them. So any of the white areas tend to register yellowish. But as it moves closer to the skin, it would make sense that that skin tone would reflect off on it, make it look a little yellow. White will pick up everything that's around it. All right. This front plane of the chest. Okay, I'm going to do one more sweep of softening with this mongoose, this tiny mongoose brush over the face, and then I've lightened those planes on the face that are lightest right here on her neck. Tiny bit here. Here. There. With a dry brush. Put them in, you take them out, you put them in, you take them out. And you eventually lay the brush down and step away from the canvas or you'll wreck it. As I'm blending, I put a little bit of the color that I'm trying to blend, a tiny bit on this brush, and just kind of barely drag it across the top. That helps make nicer transitions. And I'm going around the edge with some medium and background color just to sharpen up the edges. Not too much. I'll take a brush and soften those before I'm done, just to cover the background a little better. I don't think I have her hair big enough right here, so I'm going to have to paint back over that a little. And then a little bit more on her blouse. These dark areas right here. Especially closer to her face. That can be darker. Up here, by her neck could be a little darker, but in a warmer tone. And a little darker here. I can correct this side of the face at the same time. I noticed it when I was working over here. This doesn't look wide enough. So I can use a bigger mongoose brush to come back in. Before I do that, though, I want to add a little bit more hair. And I can measure from her eyebrow to the edge of her hair. It's the same as eyebrow to the bottom of the shadow on her lip. Yeah, so it's a lot bigger. Now, when you're painting on really, really wet paint like this, you've got to really load your brush up. There, that looks better. From the eye to the top of that curl is the same as top of the head to bottom of the eye. So this is a bit bigger as well. Angle on this collar is a little bit off. I think I must have laid in it. And I can double check it and make sure the width of it is right from her jaw to the top of the collar is the same as tear duct to the bottom of nose. So it's about right. Remember at the end to knock the reflections off by going left to right on that dark background. Because if those strokes dry, they will always pick up light. And there's a lot of medium in there, so it's pretty reflective. For some reason, left to right does it. I'm going to just do a quick glance and make sure you don't have any hard edges. I think there's more I can do. There's always more I can do, but I'm going to stop. I think there's something I can still do right around her eyes. There's always something with the eyes and the mouth. And this angle on the nose. Sargent's work always looked like he didn't struggle with it, but everything I read about him says that he would work for hours and hours with a model, and then he would tear it up and start over. So we know that they weren't effortless. It was always a fight.